Latin literature stretches across more than 1,000 years, from Rome's earliest oral traditions to masterpieces like the Aeneid. In this video, we will trace that journey step by step. We will begin with Old Latin in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, a time of small farming villages and spoken storytelling. Then, we will move into Early Latin, when Roman writers first came into contact with Greek literature and art. Then follows the Golden Age, the height of classical Latin, with famous figures like Cicero, Caesar, Virgil and Ovid. After that, we will see how literature changed in the imperial time. And finally, we will follow Latin into its later Roman phase, when Christianity arrived and the empire started to crumble. When the video is over, you will have a clear understanding of the entire history of Latin literature. Hi everybody, my name is Finn and welcome back to the Litcenter channel. Before we start with our journey through Latin literature today, it is important to grasp the following concept. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Latin still remained widely used as a lingua franca in medieval Europe. For example, it continued to be the language of the church, with religious works almost exclusively being written in Latin. But secular scholars like Isaac Newton and philosophers like Descartes also used Latin to spread their knowledge. In short, being fluent in Latin was for a long time regarded as a necessary skill in order to participate at the intellectual top, and it often functioned as a barrier between the refined upper class and the vulgar dialects of the peasants. But in this video, we are only going to focus on the Latin works that were made during the time of the ancient Romans in antiquity. To understand the beginnings of Latin literature, we first need to look at Rome itself in its earliest days. In the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Rome was not yet a marble city of emperors and legions. It was just a cluster of small simple villages built on the hills around the Tiber, a place where people lived in huts with thatched roofs, dirt roads and simple farming communities. Life was hard and basic. Most people were peasants living off the land, tending flocks and trading goods in local markets. Political power lay in the hands of kings, while religion was woven into everyday existence. Rome at this time was just one among many Latin-speaking communities in central Italy, surrounded by neighbors like the Etruscans to the north and the Greeks who had settled along the southern coasts. Stories of these early days, for example the founding by Romulus in 753 BC, the abduction of the Sabine woman and the legends around the early kings, were not written down during this time. Instead, these stories lived in memory and songs, passed down over many generations. It was only centuries later, once Rome had become powerful and literate, that authors like Livy and Virgil set these legends into writing. But by then, the stories were already a mixture of myth and history, specifically designed to give Rome a noble and heroic past. When we turn to the earliest traces of Latin writing itself, what we find is sparse. The first version of the Latin alphabet was borrowed and adapted from the Etruscans, and it looked quite different from the script we now know. Several letters were missing, and the form of others would only settle much later. The oldest surviving Latin inscription we have is a stone slab from the Roman Forum dating back to the 6th century BC. The text is fragmentary and difficult to read, but it is a rare glimpse of Latin in its infancy. And beyond inscriptions like this, no real literature survives from the Old Latin period. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had changed dramatically from its humble beginnings. It was no longer a small settlement of shepherds and farmers. It had become a military and political force on the Italian peninsula. The kings were long gone. Rome was now a republic, ruled by annually elected magistrates and guided by the Senate. Rome at this time was also expanding beyond its borders. These wars brought not only new territory and wealth, but also contact with Greek culture. Greek art, religion, and most importantly for our story, Greek literature entered Roman life. The Romans quickly realized that while they were unmatched in discipline and military power, the Greeks were centuries ahead in philosophy, art, and storytelling. To the Romans, Greece was a model of cultural refinement, and they often measured themselves against it. Conquering Greece militarily was one thing, but culturally, many Romans felt that they were the students and the Greeks the teachers. This admiration shows itself clearly in religion. The Romans did already have their own gods, like for example Jupiter, Mars and Venus, but when they came into contact with the Olympian pantheon, they recognized striking similarities. And rather than to discard their own deities, they started to identify them with their Greek counterparts, like for example Jupiter with Zeus, Mars with Ares and Venus with Aphrodite. Over time, Roman religion became a blend, keeping its own rituals and priesthoods, but adopting Greek myths and stories. The same happened in literature. Romans had songs, laws and oral traditions in their past, but no sophisticated written works. Greek literature with its epic poems, tragedies and comedies provided a ready-made model. The first Roman authors, rather than inventing entirely new genres, borrowed directly from the Greeks, translating, adapting and slowly reshaping the material to suit Roman tastes. This Greek influence is evident in the earliest Roman author we know by name, Livius Andronicus. He was originally a Greek from southern Italy brought to Rome as a slave around the mid-3rd century BC. After gaining his freedom, he turned to teaching and writing, and it was he who first adapted Greek works into Latin. His most famous contribution was a translation of Homer's Odyssey into Latin verse, an enormous cultural step, because for the first time Romans could read one of Greece's foundational epics in their own language. But Livius did not stop there. He also staged plays based on Greek tragedies and comedies. These were the first pieces of written Latin literature we know of, and though only fragments survive, they do set a pattern. Rome would continue to borrow Greek forms, but gradually reshape them with Roman themes and values. Comedy in particular flourished in this period, especially through the works of Plautus and later through the works of Terence. Plautus, writing in the early 2nd century BC, adapted Greek comedies into lively Latin plays filled with wordplay, slapstick and exaggerated characters, like for example clever slaves, boastful soldiers and cunning courtesans. His comedies were hugely popular with Roman audiences, blending Greek plots with Roman humor and everyday speech. Terence, slightly later, offered a more refined and polished style. His plays were admired for their elegance and psychological insight, even if they lacked Plautus's boisterous energy. So, in the early Latin period, which lasted roughly from the late 3rd to the early 2nd century BC, we see the foundations of a Latin literature being laid. Rome had become a Mediterranean power, its language was being shaped into a literary medium, and its writers were beginning to define what Roman literature could be, a blend of Greek influence and distinctly Roman themes. When we speak of Latin literature nowadays, most people are really thinking of the Golden Age. This is a period that produced Cicero's speeches, Caesar's commentaries, and Virgil's Aeneid. Essentially, these are the core works that shaped Europe's idea of classical Rome, and it is also this version of Latin that is taught in schools. By the 2nd century BC, Rome had conquered Carthage, subdued Greece, and established itself as the unchallenged power of the Mediterranean. These victories brought enormous wealth, slaves, and prestige to the Roman elite, but they also destabilized the Republic. A handful of aristocratic families amassed unprecedented fortunes and influence, while ordinary citizens and veterans struggled for land and opportunity. Reformers like the Gracchus brothers tried to redistribute land and address inequality, but their violent deaths in 133 BC and 121 BC revealed how political disputes in Rome were turning into matters of life and death. By the time of the late Republic, the political world was filled with conflict. Generals like Marius and Sulla fought brutal civil wars for control of Rome, and later the rivalry between Pompey and Caesar showed how deadly Roman politics had become. This harsh environment encouraged the development of rhetoric. Being able to state your argument clearly and convincingly was highly valued, and Roman children were drilled in the art of rhetoric. The two great orators of the late Republic were Cicero and Caesar, but we will see that these two figures had very different views on how Rome should be ruled. Whereas Cicero defended the old republican ideals, Caesar sought to gain sole control over Rome. No writer captures the tensions of the late Republic more vividly than Marcus Tullius Cicero. Born in a small town of Arpinum to an equestrian family, Cicero was not of Rome's old aristocracy, yet through sheer talent he rose to the highest offices of the Republic. Trained in Greek philosophy and rhetoric, he quickly gained fame as a lawyer whose oratory could sway courts and assemblies. His speeches against the corrupt governor Verres not only destroyed his opponent, but also announced Cicero as Rome's greatest orator. But Cicero was more than a courtroom advocate. He was also a statesman trying to defend the Republic at a moment when generals and warlords were tearing it apart. As consul in 63 BC, he famously suppressed the conspiracy of Catiline, boasting that he had saved the Republic, yet his victory was short-lived. When Caesar, Pompey and Crassus formed the first triumvirate, Cicero was sidelined. Beside his skills as an orator, Cicero's greatest contribution lies in his prose style and philosophical works. He wrote treatises on ethics, the ideal state, and the nature of the gods. He also gave Latin its definite form as a language of philosophy, law, and public discourse. His sentences balance clarity, rhythm, and persuasion with unmatched elegance. Later generations, from Saint Augustine to the Renaissance humanists, regarded Cicero as a model of good Latin prose. Yet his life ended almost as tragically as the Republic he sought to preserve. After Caesar's assassination, Cicero threw his support behind the young Octavian, seeing him as a tool against Mark Antony. In his Philippics, he denounced Antony in fiery speeches, but his idea ultimately failed. When Octavian and Antony reconciled, Cicero was declared an enemy of the state. In 43 BC, he was hunted down and executed. His severed head and hands were displayed in the Roman Forum, a grim symbol of free speech silenced by power. Gaius Julius Caesar. Everybody knows him as a general and statesman, but he was also a very prominent figure on the literary field. During his lifetime, Caesar was regarded as one of the best orators and prose authors in Latin. Even Cicero spoke highly of Caesar's rhetoric and style. It is believed he wrote multiple works, but unfortunately only Caesar's war commentaries have survived. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico, commentaries on the Gallic War, written in a deceptively plain, almost report-like style, the commentaries recount his campaigns in Gaul between 58 and 50 BC, where he subdued vast territories, crossed into Britain and extended Rome's reach farther than ever before. What makes these works so extraordinary is not just their historical detail, but their rhetorical purpose. Caesar wrote about himself in a third person, presenting his victories as if they were objective reports, carefully shaping his image as a brilliant yet modest commander. The commentaries are propaganda disguised as history, designed to justify his actions to the Senate and people of Rome. Caesar turns his reports into a story that should captivate as much as possible. He reconstructs battles, speeches, and provides interesting information about Gaul and its inhabitants. The latter in particular was greatly appreciated by the readers. The image of the savage and barbaric Gaul was deeply ingrained in the Roman psyche. They loved hearing stories about this faraway and mysterious country. And largely because of these fascinating stories, Caesar's popularity in Rome skyrocketed, which was exactly what he intended. But Caesar's rise also accelerated the Republic's collapse. His rivalry with Pompey plunged Rome into a civil war. After Caesar's victory at Pharsalus in 48 BC and his appointment as dictator for life, Caesar stood poised to reshape Rome into a monarchy in all but name. This ambition cost him his life. In March 44 BC, a group of senators, including Brutus and Cassius, assassinated him in the theater of Pompeii. In the power vacuum that followed, Caesar's adopted heir Octavian, who later would change his name to Augustus, defeated Antony and Cleopatra and established himself as Rome's first emperor. With the Republic dead, a new age began, not only politically but also culturally. Augustus understood the power of culture and gathered around him a circle of poets whose work would glorify Rome's destiny and Augustus's own rule. Among these poets were Virgil, whose Aeneid became Rome's national epic, Horace, who refined lyric poetry into polished odes, and Ovid, whose playful Metamorphoses transformed myth into dazzling narrative art. Thus, the assassination of Caesar marks a double turning point: the fall of the Republican world of Cicero and Caesar, and the dawn of the Augustan age, when poetry, not rhetoric, became the vehicle of Rome's cultural identity. If you are interested in Caesar and the Bello Gallico, I have an entire video devoted to this subject. It is really interesting. You can watch it on the channel. No poet is more closely connected to the age of Augustus than Publius Vergilius Maro, or Virgil as we know him today. He was born in 70 BC near Mantua in northern Italy, far from the bustle of Roman politics. Yet his poetry brought him into the circle of Augustus' trusted advisor Maecenas, where he became one of the leading voices of the new regime. Virgil's earliest works, the Eclogues or Bucolics, written in the 40s BC, were pastoral poems inspired by the Greek poet Theocritus. On the surface, they described shepherds, rustic landscapes and songs of love, yet beneath the idyllic setting lies the turmoil of the times. Confiscated farms, displaced peasants, and the longing for peace after years of bloodshed. Already, Virgil was weaving contemporary Roman experience into borrowed Greek forms, giving pastoral poetry new depth and resonance. Virgil's next work, the Georgics, seems at first like a straightforward poem about farming, because it talks about plowing the fields, tending the vines and caring for bees, but beneath its surface it is much more than a farmer's manual. The poem reflects on labor, order and the fragile balance between human effort and the forces of nature. But it is with the creation of the Aeneid that Virgil secured his place as Rome's greatest poet. Written in 12 books and inspired by Homer, the poem follows the Trojan hero Aeneas as he flees the ruins of Troy and journeys to Italy, where his descendants will one day found the city of Rome. Along the way, we see some of its most famous episodes. His doomed love affair with Dido in Carthage, his descent into the underworld to glimpse Rome's future, and the fierce battles in Latium that end with his victory over Turnus. But the Aeneid is more than a simple tale of adventure. It ties Rome's origins to the heroic age of Troy, it gives divine sanction to its destiny, and reflects Augustus' vision of a renewed empire after years of civil war. Yet Virgil does not make Aeneas a flawless hero. He is often torn between personal longing and the demands of fate. And the poem's ending, Aeneas killing Turnus in anger, leaves us with a sense of unease rather than triumph. That tension between glory and sacrifice is what makes the Aeneid so powerful and why it has been read and studied for over 2000 years. When Virgil died in 19 BC, the Aeneid was still unfinished, and he reportedly asked for it to be destroyed. Augustus, however, made sure it was preserved, recognizing its importance. In the centuries that followed, the poem became central to Roman education. School children practiced reading and writing its verses. Public figures cited it, and later European writers from Dante to Milton drew inspiration from it. In Virgil, we see the golden age of Latin literature at its peak. His work forms the bridge between Greece and Rome, and it is often said that with the Aeneid, Roman literature finally reached equal footing with the ancient epics of the Greeks. If you are interested in the works of Virgil, and specifically the Aeneid, I have an entire video devoted to this subject. You can find it on the channel. If Virgil gave Rome its national epic, then Horace gave it its voice in everyday poetry. Born in 65 BC to a freedman father in Venusia, Horace's early life already reflected the fluid but competitive world of late Republican Rome. He actually fought against Augustus during the Civil War, serving as a staff officer in Brutus's army. But after receiving a pardon, he returned to Rome and slowly built a literary career. His fortunes changed when he was introduced to Maecenas, the powerful advisor and cultural patron of Augustus. Under Maecenas' protection, Horace enjoyed not only financial stability, but also the freedom to craft some of the most elegant and enduring poetry in Latin literature. Horace mastered several genres, for example lyric odes, satires and epistles, each revealing a different side of his genius. His odes are polished, carefully structured poems that adapt Greek lyric forms into Latin, celebrating love, friendship, wine, and the simple pleasures of life, but also offering reflections on fate and mortality. The famous idea of carpe diem, seizing the day, comes from Horace's verse, capturing his blend of wit and philosophical resignation. His satires and epistles, on the other hand, are written in a more conversational style, where he gently mocks human follies, critiques Roman society, and even reflects on his own flaws. What makes Horace so distinctive is his balance. Unlike the fiery passion of Catullus or the grandeur of Virgil, Horace's poetry values moderation, wit, and refinement. He became the poet of measured wisdom, offering lessons that felt both deeply Roman and yet universal. And in doing so, he ensured that his works would remain at the core of education and literary culture for centuries, just as essential as Virgil's Aeneid, but speaking in a more personal and human register. Ovid was the youngest of the great Augustan poets, born in 43 BC just as the Republic changed into the Empire. Unlike Virgil and Horace, who lived through the turbulence of the Civil War, Ovid came of age in a Rome already firmly under the control of Augustus. His career unfolded in a city that was wealthy, secure, and eager to enjoy its new position as the capital of the Mediterranean world. His early works, like the Amores and the Ars Amatoria, the Art of Love, captured the sophisticated, sometimes scandalous world of Roman romance. Witty, playful, and often irreverent, they made him immensely popular among readers, but less so with Augustus, who promoted stricter moral values. This tension would eventually define Ovid's fate. His masterpiece, the Metamorphoses, is unlike anything else in Latin literature. Across 15 books, Ovid strings together more than 250 myths, all connected by the theme of transformation, hence the name Metamorphoses. The poem begins at the very beginning of time, with chaos giving way to the ordered world, and ends with Julius Caesar turning into a star in the heavens. In between, Ovid retells the entire mythological heritage of Greece and Rome, weaving one tale into another so that the stories feel like a continuous fabric rather than isolated episodes. It retells the famous mythical stories of, for example, Daedalus and Icarus, or Daphne and Apollo. In each of these stories, something happens that causes the characters to undergo a change or transformation. This change can be physical, like Daphne turning into a laurier tree to escape Apollo, but it can also be a psychological change, like the hubris that befalls Icarus when he flies too close to the sun, which causes his wax wings to melt. Ovid's style was very different from that of his contemporaries. Where Virgil sought grandeur and destiny, Ovid preferred playfulness, elegance, and irony. In his work, the gods have very human flaws. They are often driven by lust or jealousy, and his human heroes often struggle with desire and vanity. This lighter tone made him popular with the public, but it did not sit well with Augustus' moral reforms. In 8 AD, Ovid was suddenly exiled to the remote city of Tomis on the Black Sea. He described the reason as Carmen et Error, a poem and a mistake. The poem was almost certainly his Ars Amatoria, the Art of Love, a handbook on seduction that contradicted Augustus' family legislation. The mistake remains unclear, but scholars have speculated about a possible involvement in scandals with the imperial family. Whatever the case, Ovid never returned to Rome and spent his last years writing from exile. But despite his banishment, Ovid's influence only grew. The Metamorphoses became the single most important source of classical mythology for the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Medieval scholars mined it for allegory, Renaissance painters drew their subjects from it, and poets from Dante to Shakespeare borrowed his imagery. Another important literary figure is Livy, the historian whose Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city, traces Rome history from its legendary origins through the Republic and into the early Empire. Livy combines storytelling with moral reflection, using historical events to illustrate virtues such as courage, loyalty, and piety. While his work is sometimes criticized for idealizing the past, it became a foundational text for understanding Roman identity. Finally, the poet Manilius contributed to more specialized genres. Manilius wrote the Astronomica, an ambitious didactic poem on astrology, blending science, myth, and poetry. Though his work is less widely read than the giants of the Golden Age, it demonstrates the diversity of literary activity in this period. By the end of the Augustan Golden Age, the political landscape of Rome had been completely reshaped. The centuries-old republic, with its senates, assemblies, and elected magistrates, had effectively ended. In its place, Augustus set up the Principate. He held almost all the real power, but kept the old republican offices and traditions as kind of a show. This system allowed him, and the emperors who came after him, to rule Rome like a monarchy, even if it didn't officially look like one. With the establishment of the Principate, political life became more centralized, and the freedom of public speech that had characterized the late Republic was curtailed. Senators, orators, and writers now had to navigate a climate where criticism of the regime could be dangerous. This shift in artistic freedom shaped the literature of the Silver Age, a period roughly spanning from the reign of Tiberius to the reign of Nero. Among the most prominent writers of this era is Seneca the Younger, whose philosophical works and letters provide insight into Stoic thought while reflecting the anxieties of life under an absolute ruler. In his letters to Lucilius, Seneca addresses moral questions, the management of anger, and the fleeting nature of life, all while writing under the shadow of Nero's increasingly tyrannical rule. His tragedies likewise explore human passion, guilt, and revenge, often echoing the intensity of Greek models but filtered through a distinctly Roman sensibility. The historian Tacitus provides another cornerstone of Silver Age literature. In works like the Annals and the Histories, he documents the Julio-Claudian and Flavian dynasties with a mixture of moral reflection and sharp political observation. Tacitus is famous for his conciseness, pointed irony, and attention to the corruption, ambition, and decadence of the ruling elite. Through his work, we gain both a historical record and a critique of power under the Principate. Other notable figures include the poet Lucan, whose Pharsalia recounts a civil war between Caesar and Pompey with epic grandeur and psychological insight. Martial, meanwhile, perfected the epigram, crafting short, witty, and often cynical poems that reveal the social and cultural life of Rome in miniature. Juvenal, in contrast, satirizes the moral decay and excesses of Rome under the emperors. His satires exposed corruption, greed, and the erosion of traditional values. The famous phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, comes from his work, highlighting his critique of a populace distracted by entertainment while political corruption flourishes. Pliny the Younger, a statesman and letter writer, offers a different perspective. His letters provide an intimate glimpse into Roman administrative life, social etiquette, and personal reflection. They also preserve eyewitness accounts of major events, such as the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, described in his famous letter detailing the death of his uncle Pliny the Elder. Through these letters we see both the workings of imperial administration and the private life of a Roman elite, making Pliny an invaluable source for historians and literature alike. The Silver Age, therefore, is less about national glory or timeless myth, and more on the everyday and political realities of Rome under imperial rule. Writers had to navigate censorship and surveillance, and their works reflect both the brilliance and the anxieties of the city at its peak. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was facing mounting pressure on multiple fronts. Political instability had become routine, emperors were often overthrown or assassinated, and rival generals frequently contested for power. Economically, the empire struggled with inflation, overtaxation, and disruption in trade, while repeated invasions by Germanic tribes, such as the Goths and the Vandals, challenged the security of Rome's frontiers. Cities that had once thrived on commerce and civic life now faced unrest, and the population of Rome itself declined as disease, famine, and warfare took their toll. Amid these upheavals, religion was also transforming the empire. Christianity, which had begun as a small persecuted sect, gradually gained followers across the empire. The conversion of Emperor Constantine in 312 AD, followed by the Edict of Milan, legalized Christianity, making a profound shift in Roman culture and thought. By the end of the 4th century, under Theodosius I, Christianity became the official state religion. Pagan temples, rituals, and traditional literary patronage declined, while Christian writers increasingly dominated the intellectual landscape. The Latin language, which was already the language of law and administration, now became central to Christian worship, theological writing, and ecclesiastical scholarship. Christian authors like Tertullian, Jerome, and Augustine produced works in Latin that explored morality, theology, and the meaning of human life. These religious works would shape medieval European thought for centuries. In short, the classical age of the pagan Latin authors was over, and with the first Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, the time for the Christian Church has begun. As the Western Roman Empire weakened under internal decay and invasions, the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 AD by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, conventionally marking the fall of the Western Roman Empire. While Roman political structures disappeared, the Latin language persisted. Over time, spoken Latin diverged into what would become the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Yet Latin would continue to exist in written form, where it was used as a shared medium of learning, administration, and the church. If you know something interesting about Latin literature, feel free to share it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how people from different places and backgrounds perceive Roman literature. I also have a question for you. In the area where you grew up, is it possible to take Latin classes in high school? Where I'm from, it's quite common. My own school offered Latin and I had 5 hours of it every week throughout my entire high school career. I would love to hear if it's similar or different in other countries, so let me know in the comments. That's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like. It really helps me with the Roman algorithm. It really helps me with the YouTube algorithm. I will see you in the next video.